Sport Business. Global Sports Intelligence.
Hello and welcome once again to the Sport Business Podcast, getting you up to speed with the stories powering the global sports industry across media rights, sponsorship, events, sport tech, and more. I'm Catherine Davies, host of the Sport Business Podcast. This week, we're mixing things up a bit. We've invited questions from you, our listeners, to ask us what we know and what we think about a range of key topics and issues facing the sports industry. From the dozens of questions sent in over the past few weeks, we selected a handful that we think represent some of the key burning topics of the day, which we'll discuss over the course of the next hour. And here with me today to bring their insights to the table are Jonathan Rest, our global news reporter, Imran Yusuf, the editor of Sport Business Media, Ben Cronin, global sponsorship editor, and Duncan Griffiths Nashaniki, our managing editor of Reports and Partnerships, making his debut. Welcome, team. Thank you for joining me today.
Hi, Catherine.
Hi, Catherine.
Hey, Catherine. Glad to get the call up.
Hi, Catherine.
Now, we've had a series of questions sent in, too many to address today, but the ones we've chosen reflect the topics that we've been writing about and reporting on frequently in recent weeks. We're going to start with one sent to you, John, from a contact in the US, and it will be a timely and pertinent question to discuss, I believe. And that question was, now that the FIFA Club World Cup has finished, how do you think FIFA will commercialise the tournament going forward? Will it be bundled into future media and sponsorship packages, or do you think there's commercial appetite now from the market to keep this as a standalone tournament? John, what do you think?
Yeah, I'll take it from the media side, and then maybe Ben might want to come in from more of the sponsorship angle. I think if you're looking ahead to the next edition of the Club World Cup, which will be 2029, unless Gianni can get it into 2027 already, I don't think it will be. I think, FIFA has sold a number of the rights already for both the 26 and 2030 World Cup that they bundled together. And in addition to that, there's a number of live tenders in the market at the moment. So I don't think there's going to be the appetite to be renegotiating any of those contracts. Again, if you're looking at 2029 as the next Club World Cup, Spain has been mooted as a potential host, perhaps as a World Cup warm-up, as we had with the US this year. Well, you've got the Women's Euros in 2029. We've seen a very strong free-to-air commitment to this year's Women's Euros through the EBU. So there's not going to be a lot of room in those schedules for, the free-to-air broadcasters to be putting on Club World Cup games again. I think beyond that, if you're looking at 2033, again, keeping to the quadrennial cycle, is the Club World Cup going to be in Saudi? Quite possibly as a kind of warm up to the main event in 2034. And then you kind of have to look at the geopolitics and what's the DAZN Saudi FIFA relationship going to look like by then. I'd kind of urge podcast listeners to go back to an episode we did a fair few months ago where Frank Dunn talked in depth about that and what that relationship could become. Is this DAZN $1 billion rescue package, as some people called it, for this year's Club World Cup, part of a wider strategy? Are they going to be looking at a major package of World Cup rights by 2034? And then maybe you can foresee some kind of bundle with the Club World Cup. But, let's not forget how much of a struggle this was for FIFA to sell in the first place on the media side, especially. Talks with free-to-air broadcasters worldwide last year did not go down well at all. Many that myself and Imran and Martin had spoken to came away from that meeting surprised by, I think, the aggressive sales pitch that they were getting, that, this is the greatest tournament ever. You need to be a part of it. And, a ball hadn't been kicked. Now, of course, FIFA will point to this being a massive success. The TV figures in certain markets, particularly South America, have been very strong. So FIFA may well look at this and go, actually, this, when we go to market for this for 2029, we're in a really strong position media-wise to kind of make this a huge commercial success in its own right. But certainly, no, I don't think right now it's going to happen. I don't know if Ben has a different opinion on that from a sponsorship point of view.
I think it is slightly different from a sponsorship perspective. I mean, in the question, there's a telling part of the question, which is what does the market want? I think what the market wants is very different to what FIFA wants, or there's an important distinction between the two parties there. I think they will keep it separate as a standalone sponsorship entity. For this edition, they went out of their way to emphasise that it wasn't included in any FIFA partner packages, even though that caused a bit of a falling out with Coke and Adidas. companies were both reported to have been less than thrilled to be invited to tender for it, even though they thought they'd already got it as part of their long-standing FIFA partner contracts. Both of them went and lodged separate cases with Swiss arbitrators, arguing that they should get the rights to the tournament by default. We still don't actually know what happened in that case, but both of them were ultimately announced as sponsors of the tournament. We don't know whether they had to pay up in the end or whether they got the rights to the tournament because the arbitrator found it in their favour. But I think you can say for certain is that any FIFA partner contract moving forward, it won't include the Club World Cup by default, and you'd have to agree a separate deal to get the tournament. I mean, you can see that. I think our understanding is Qatar Airways had to do a separate deal, even though they were announced as a FIFA partner in 2023. As far as I know, other established sponsors also had to get the tournament separately. So the likes of Visa, AB InBev, Lenovo, they'd have also had to agree standalone deals. If you look at what FIFA's trying to do, I think they're trying to create something that's comparable to the UEFA Champions League. That's always been sold as a separate sponsorship entity. As I've said on previous podcasts, I think UEFA is very good at having separate national team football, UEFA Champions League and women's football sponsorship packages. There's some sponsors that will always take rights across every single competition, but there's also a healthy mix of brands that just sponsor standalone properties. If you look at payment services, for example, you've got Alipay in men's national team football. You've got MasterCard in the men's Champions League. You've got Visa in women's football. And it's really good not to have all of your eggs in one basket. It also creates a bit of competitive tension to have rival brands lurking in other parts of your portfolio. And it's always been said that national team football, it appeals to a different cohort of brands. So it's seen as being more family friendly. You know, kids are more interested in national team football. I look at my own family. My nephews are mad about watching England, less interested in the Premier League. So that attracts family friendly brands. That's less the case, you could say, for club football, which is a bit more tribal. FIFA and Gianni Infantino, I think they're very keen for the Club World Cup to be seen as sort of standing on its own 2 feet. I don't think that was necessarily the case this time. I think there was a lot of horse trading that went on, and a lot of the deals that were agreed were, you know, with one eye on maybe the Men's World Cup next year. I think that might have been the bigger prize. And you hear some of the numbers that were being bandied around for, I mean, the Hisense deal, we heard that was as much as 90 million. I'd be very surprised if that part of that wasn't, you know, related to a future announcement of a Men's World Cup deal or something like that. And I think, you know, the internal allocations, the sums that are being allocated to the Club World Cup from FIFA might be a little bit different to the allocations from the brands, you know, the value they attribute to the tournament.
Right. Thank you both for that. I'm sure we'll be discussing this subject endlessly in podcasts in the future. Question 2 came to Ben last week, and it's on a similar subject on sponsorship for the FIFA World Cup. And Ben, the question you got was, FIFA recently announced American Airlines as a regional North American sponsor for next year's Men's World Cup. But how can it have a second airline sponsor when Qatar Airways already sponsors the event?
So the reason for that is Qatar Airways has got a strategic partnership with American Airlines. So strictly speaking, they're not competitors. And what that partnership allows them to do is provide seamless travel, reciprocal benefits between the two. So you could, for example, you could use your air miles that you earned on Qatar Airways with American Airlines. And that also allows them to offer a network of destinations. Qatar Airways is very much an international carrier. So it will likely be transporting fans from international locations to the US, Mexico and Canada next summer. And that's reflected in the fact that it's a global partner of FIFA. American Airlines, on the other hand, is better placed to provide domestic travel within America. The service is complementary to Qatar Airways, and that is reflected in the fact it's got a regional supporter deal. So it's a lower deal with rights to activate in just the US, and there's less LED rights in that. Looking at that deal, you could expect the two to use their sponsorship with FIFA to reward frequent flyers, potentially, you know, getting free tickets to the event, but very much working hand in hand rather than you know, being competitors. So they're both really fine with that deal.
Right. Okay, Ben, that clears it up for me. That's an interesting question, and I'm glad we addressed that. Let's move on to question 3, which was sent in to us by Jochen Losch, who our listeners will know from his extensive trajectory in the industry, first with Sport5 and then with Traffic Sports in Brazil, and then MP in Silva, and he's now CEO of JL Sports Investments, a UK-based advisory and consultancy. Let's listen to his question now.
Hi, Catherine. Hi, everyone. This is Jochen Losch. Great to hear your voices and to keep learning from your expertise, as I've done for so many years. So Comcast just sold Sky Germany to RTL for basically spare change after paying billions for it a few years ago. And honestly, nobody's ever made a cent with the thing, going all the way back to Premiere in the early 90s with Leo Kirch, Rupert Murdoch, Comcast, all lost their shirts. So is this finally the proof that the pay TV sports model just isn't a viable business in Germany? Whether it's linear streaming or anything else, is it actually a viable business anywhere?
John, I think you have something to add on that, don't you?
Yeah, just on Germany specifically, it's always been a low penetration of pay TV subscribers, despite the size of the market. People there don't particularly like paying for their pay TV subscription. So the numbers for pay TV in general in Germany have been declining. Sky has not been profitable there. So I think that's why they've gone for a song, if you like, but perhaps Imran's got a bit more of a background on the wider pay TV market, and we can talk a bit more globally as well, perhaps.
Well, in a way, the question posed by Jochen is sort of what we try and answer on Sport Business Media pretty much on a daily basis. We may do an analysis of, say, EuroLeague rights in Italy, but behind that, what we're really asking is if the models of the past couple of decades are still holding up. Someone like Jochen, through his career, would have seen pay TV powering the growth of sport through media rights increases. In the later years of that boom, that would have come through bundling with other services, such as internet offered by telcos. We're in a different place now, as has been written about a lot over the last couple of years. Cord cutting is not abating. Cable and satellite subscribers are down in pretty much every major market. The distribution has changed. Streamers have come in. Netflix leading the way on that, of course. And I think RTL, armed now with Sky Deutschland's assets, will want to take on Netflix as much as it can in the German market. And of course, there are more options vying for our attention through screens, particularly on our phones, through TikTok and Instagram. And so in that scenario, I've had this phrase of the last few years, flat is the new up, which even top tier properties are finding due to the conditions of the pay TV market. Interestingly, I looked up some Sky financials. So 11 years ago, 2014, Sky B, as it was then, reported a fall in pre-tax profits, but to 527 million in the 6 months to December of that year, 2014. Of course, Sky now is heavily loss-making in the hundreds of millions, and the Germany business and also its Italy business, write-downs on those are a big part of that. So we're in a different place. I talked to Frank, who again would have had us, ridden the waves, so to speak, of the same pay TV boom of the last couple of decades. Frank Dunn, our esteemed, our maestro, as we call him. And he talked about how the consumer ultimately doesn't want to pay for his or her bundle in the same way he did before. And that's why pay TV numbers are down and pay TV is more challenging, because before the consumer got that big package and might have added on sports channels, and essentially they made most of their margin on the stuff you didn't want. Fragmentation has killed that model. So Jochen, I'd say, well, it's the $62 billion question. That's the value of sports media rights. We had in our Gold Media report last year. And as we know, every rights held, every media company is trying to navigate.
Yeah, and it's not just on kind of traditional pay TV operators, is it? It's if you look at kind of wider sports subscription platforms in general, as you say, people don't really want to pay. You look at what happened recently in Australia with Optus, a telco that made a huge splash a few years ago on premium rights, and now Optus Sports media rights contracts and their subscriber agreements are going to have been sold to Nine Entertainment as of, I think, August the 1st. Why? Well, they spent, arguably too much money on English Premier League rights to be able to refinance it. So it's not just your kind of legacy pay TV operators then, Whistle Stop Geography Tour take you to the US and you can see what Warner Bros. Discovery and Comcast have been doing over the last 6 months, splitting their legacy cable TV business with the streaming. Now, they're still, driving huge revenues, but it's a sign, isn't it, that perhaps the traditional pay TV sports market maybe isn't working. And the streamers are very much here to stay.
And of course, we talked about that last week in the podcast, didn't we? The example of Cage TV in Brazil, which the latest news is that it will show all 104 FIFA World Cup matches for free across its YouTube and social media channels next year. But of course, it also showed all the matches of the Club World Cup this past month. And it was released in Máquina do Esporte that it got over 5 billion views for the FIFA Club World Cup across YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. I mean, it's pretty hard for pay TV broadcasters to compete with that, isn't it? It's shown for free, and a significant portion of their listeners are in that coveted demographic of 18 to 30. So that's what they're facing, isn't it? These traditional pay TV broadcasters. Right. Well, that's something we'll certainly be readdressing in podcasts coming up and across sport, business, media, and sponsorship. Let's move on to the next question, which takes us across the Atlantic or up north to Canada. And this question comes from Peter Menzies, who is a well-known media executive in Canada, and he's formerly the vice chair of the CRTC, the Canadian Telecoms and Broadcasting Regulator. And his question is there any nation in the world remotely similar to Canada in that it allows its licensed sports broadcasters to flood the market with US content, send almost all of its rights dollars outside the country, and actively suppress domestic leagues, making their economic survival impossible? And all because of a very slim geographic part of the country can pick up US signals over the air. Now that's quite a loaded question, and it's pertinent to Canada and perhaps not to many other markets in the world. But I think it's relevant because I've had many listeners and colleagues over the years ask me why Canada is so difficult to deal with, to sell rights into. And just recently, I was speaking to people at the Ekstraklasa, the Polish league, which have been trying for years to get some exposure in Canada. And in the end, they've done a deal with beIN Sports in Canada and not any Canadian broadcaster. And I'll just give you a little bit of background, and then John and Imran, perhaps you can see if there's anything similar in the world. But what happened in Canada is that in the 60s and 70s, pockets of Canadians across the border could pick up US channels over the air for free. And then when the cable industry started, those cable operators were able to pick up those signals as well for free, and they sold them to Canadian consumers in a bundle with some Canadian channels, which they had to pay for. And the American broadcasters weren't that concerned because they didn't care about Canadian viewers. The advertisers didn't care. So what happened really was that it distorted the market. The Canadian market became flooded with American programming, and there was no incentive for Canadian programmers to make their own programming. And it was the same with sport. So outside of the CFL, which is the Canadian Gridiron Football League, and the NHL, there's no financial incentives to produce any sports content or even pay for it. So the domestic Canadian leagues, which have gamely started up in the past few years, the CPL, the Men's Soccer Football League, and the NSL, the Women's Professional League, and then the CEBL Basketball League, the PWHL Women's Ice Hockey League, they all pay to produce their own content, and they secure, in some cases, they've secured barter deals with TSN or Sportsnet, the two sports broadcasters, or they produce their own streaming channels. And so if they do give it to TSN or Sportsnet, those two broadcasters are getting the Canadian content that they need to operate. They're getting it for free. And so the whole point, this is Peter's last comment, and I'll finish up here, but Peter's last point was the whole point of TSN and Sportsnet when they were created was to invest in Canadian content and prevent an ESPN or a US channel from jumping the border and flooding Canadian households with US content. And now TSN, which is 20% owned by ESPN, is practically ESPN anyway in Canada. So there isn't really a Canadian market. And Peter ended that with a very pointed comment about the 51st state, and he left it at there. So it illustrates the problem with what is really the Americanization of Canadian culture, which is that the CRTC and the CBC and even TSN and Sportsnet were all created to prevent Canada from becoming what it has become. And Peter says that's a monstrous failing in the system. Now that might give some information to people looking to enter the Canadian market, a bit of a warning perhaps, and armed with information is no bad thing. But I don't think, John and Imran, there's anything similar in other markets where you have a minnow, like perhaps Switzerland faced with Germany on its border. Is there anything similar that you know of in the world?
No. We were kind of thinking of this when we got this question in. Nothing we can kind of think of. I mean, it's a kind of free market, isn't it, in places to do as you wish. I mean, coming from living in in England, you've got the Premier League, which is this kind of powerhouse commercially around the world that kind of comes in and dominates the airwaves and probably a lot of broadcasters' international sports budgets. But they're still spending money on domestic football. You know, if you look at the Swedish league, I think the Allsvenskan, I think their current deal's worth in the region of 50 million euros per season. So that, you know, that's a good number for that league. The Premier League deal is 7 or 8 times more than that, but that, you know, that's a pan-Nordic deal. So, you know, they're getting dwarfed in terms of the money that's been spent on them, but they're still getting, you know, they're scheduling strong and they're still getting eyeballs and they're still getting money, which is obviously different to, you know, the point that Peter makes, which is the kind of Canadian sports are being ignored. I don't know if Imran's got kind of a wider gaze than me in Sweden.
No, I do agree with John there, and that's sort of the risk of sounding like Ayn Rand or Milton Friedman. This is kind of the free market in action. Again, on the Premier League, you look at somewhere like Thailand, a football mad country. The Premier League, I think this was one of the most eye-popping stories for Sport Business Media we did in the last year or so. The Premier League fee from the upcoming season onwards is touching $100 million a year just in Thailand. Well, sorry, I think it also takes in Cambodian laos, but most of the value's in Thailand. Its own domestic league has done a deal also with the same telco, Jasmine International, and another telco, and that's around $15 million in total per season. Well, the top 3 leagues actually, and some women's leagues as well, along with the sort of domestic cup. So you can see the huge difference there. Premier League, again, something that football mad fans in Thailand want to watch. Doesn't make them less patriotic, but sort of voting with their feet in a sense.
One thing I would add, Catherine, is I can't think of an example where, and we've talked about this on previous pods, haven't we, where, you know, the Vancouver Whitecaps being in the CONCACAF Champions League, I can't think of an example where that kind of level of game would not be, you know, sub-licensed to a kind of wider broadcast, and it just wasn't the case in Canada, right? You had to go to a big screen in the middle of Vancouver to actually watch it.
I think also in Europe and other parts of the world, you do have listed events legislation where sports events of national importance are not mandated to be on free-to-air television, but they have to be offered on fair and reasonable terms to free-to-air television. And there's never been any such thing here. And then, of course, you have the issue of the cross-border leagues. You have the Toronto Raptors in the American Basketball League when we have a, you know, moderately thriving professional men's league in Canada. And of course, the Canadian Premier League has clubs across the country, but the Whitecaps and Toronto FC and the Montreal team play in the American Major League Soccer. So that is quite unique. It's a situation where you have a Goliath just south of the border of how many million, 300 million people, and then there's little Canada up north with 40 million. So it is a fairly unique situation in the world, I think. Right. Well, finally, we're going to move on to our last question, and we're going to switch continents and sports, and we're going to home in on cricket. Duncan is going to provide a brief synopsis of the Sport Business Global Cricket Report, which was released last week. He's going to present the key topics and give us a snapshot of the comprehensive and very high-end data and analysis included in the report, and then we'll move on to a discussion related to a question we've had sent in. Duncan.
Cool, thank you, Catherine, and great to be making my Sport Business Podcast debut. I feel like I'm coming on in the 80th minute for a little stretch of the legs, so very happy to be here. Yeah, as you mentioned, the Global Cricket Report is, as the name suggests, a commercial deep dive into the state of cricket as it is right now. It's obviously a really fascinating sport that has been rapidly modernising in very dynamic ways in the last decade or so. And that's kind of why we decided to do it now. You know, it's one of the fastest growing sports in terms of media rights value globally, but that growth is really powered by one country and, to be more specific, one league in the IPL. There are new T20 leagues and franchises which have huge financial backing from private equity and technology moguls, and that's reshaping governance and commercial priorities. And obviously it'll be at the next Olympics, which is something we've covered in quite some depth on Sport Business. So in the report itself, we dig into various things. There's lots of data, lots of insights from people who are involved in the game. We look at the current commercial landscape with a really big focus on media rights, specifically the ICC and their rights fee increase over the current cycle. We look at, market by market breakdown of other key territories around the world, flatlining bilateral series. We also have data on sponsorship figures from the last ICC World Cup, with a view on the next one. Then there's a deep dive into the IPL from both a media rights point of view, but also key sponsorship figures for front of shirt sponsors and title sponsorship. We look at staggering numbers behind cricket's online audience boom. So that's most clearly fueled by young Indian fandom and what that means for the game. And in particular, we have a really interesting case study about fantasy cricket and the huge numbers that are playing and engaging with the game in India and what that means in terms of opportunities around the world. Then there's a look at some of the other T20 leagues that are happening. We analysed 6 of those, including everything from their domestic media rights deals to the partners they have, and really focus on the opportunities that exist in non-traditional cricket markets. And we also have a real look at multi-club ownership and 3 key empires around the world and the impact that is having on player availability and centralised contracts, which is obviously a massive issue for Test cricket and the future of that. And then finally, the 100, obviously a topic that's been very keenly brought up and debated over the last, 6 months or so. We look at that as an entity and analyse the, some might say, quite optimistic estimations that the ECB have in terms of revenue and where the 100 is going.
Right. Well, Duncan, you mentioned the 100, the limited over tournament for men and women that starts in just a couple of weeks. And we have a question sent in about that from none other than Lalit Modi, the founder of the Indian Premier League. Let's listen to that question now. And I think Imran is going to address what Mr. Modi asks.
Hi, this is Lalit Modi, founder of IPL. Tell me what you are hearing on the investments in the 100. Have the investors actually signed up? Have they paid up? Or are they in still negotiating mode? Let us know your answer.
Imran, tell us, how would you address his question?
Great to hear from Lalit, founder, of course, of the IPL. And he's been very interested in the 100. He was quite outspoken before the sale of the teams about the ECB, that's the English Cricket Board, perhaps being optimistic with some of their, particularly their media rights projections. He sort of put out an analysis, I think, through Twitter and other social media. Sport Business Media did its own analysis of those, if you want to go and have a look. But in the end, the ECB will have been quite pleased, of course, with its sales process. John did a pretty good deep dive on that around the spring, I think, if you want to go read about the details. You know, for those who don't know, the 100 is the ECB sort of flagship now, limited overs competition, launched in 2021. It's 100 balls each team. It tries to bring in people who aren't necessarily already sort of existing cricket fans. And the ECB sold stakes, they're 49% stake in each of the teams, but some of the investors took more than that, a couple even taking full 100%. And these are just for the 100 teams, of which there are 8, not the actual counties. Now, what happened, because ECB raised about, just over £500 million, which was great news for English cricket, growth in the game, all that stuff. But what happened a couple of months ago was it turned out that these investors, who, John has rightly said, weren't philanthropists. They love their cricket, but are ultimately hard-nosed businessmen. They wanted a few more things from the ECB, a few more guarantees. One of them was that the ECB could technically scrap the competition after 7 years. They wanted that removed. They wanted a bit more control on the 100 board. Things like the media rights, which at the moment bundled up with the ECB's domestic media rights. So the big deal with Sky, there's an allocation for the 100. They wanted that unbundled. And, these discussions have been happening. The ECB had its AGM in May. The news that came out of that was that the final sign-offs would be imminent. So that's really what Lalit's question pertains to. Why have we not had the big announcement? What we're hearing is the ECB has sort of agreed to those, if you want to call them concessions. There will be more voting rights to the teams. They dropped that right to unilaterally close the tournament. I don't think that was on the cards anyway. I think the media rights stuff, everyone's aligned now. And we are hearing from some sources, particularly out of India, because, the investors are largely Indian or US investors, that, everything's agreed. So I expect that the announcements will be pretty imminent, Mr. Modi.
Well, that's brilliant, Imran. Thank you. And thank you to all of you, John, Ben, Duncan, Imran, and of course, a shout out to our lovely editor, Lumi. Thank you all for joining me. Invaluable insights as always. And thank you to our listeners for your questions and your feedback. We hope you enjoyed the show. And if you want to know more about today's stories or any of our other reports and analyses, and especially if you're looking for the world's largest collection of accurate rights fees across media and sponsorship, you can take a look at subscription options on our website or get in touch with us via email at info@sportbusiness.com. If you enter the code SBPodcast30 at the checkout, you'll get a 30% discount on annual and monthly Sport Business subscriptions. You can also share your thoughts on this episode and give us your feedback in a review on the Apple Podcast and Spotify platforms. And watch for our weekly LinkedIn posts promoting the podcast, where you can, of course, leave your comments. Thank you all for tuning in, for reading, for subscribing. I'm Catherine Davies, and we'll be back again next week with the Sport Business Podcast.